Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this event looking at designing governance systems to enable effective implementation of the Paris Agreement. Special welcome to those who are watching us online via UNFCCC YouTube channel. We have a wonderful panel tonight which will share experiences from all around the world. But before we start, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics, Interparliamentary Union, IPU, Center for Policy Research in India, and Climate Legal in South Africa, which are the organizations which have worked in partnership to put this event together. As we are coming to the end of the scope, I think it's fair to say that we're finding ourselves in quite a worrying and challenging situation. While we have had many new targets committed coming out of Glasgow last year, COP26, we had over 120 countries committing net zero targets through their NDCs or through political statements last year. If we look at the actual implementation and embeddedness of those targets into national governance frameworks, the story is quite different. There are only 20 countries around the world which have so far introduced net zero targets into their national climate laws, and a few more which have introduced them into their national climate policies. The UN GAP report, which was released just before this COP, clearly showed that current policies that are in place will only get us to 2.8 degree of global warming. And if we want to be at 1.5 and below 2 degrees, we need to do much better. If we look at the current net zero commitments, assuming they will be implemented, we could keep global warming to 1.8 degrees according to UN GAP report. But this is a big assumption because the same report actually says there are serious questions about credibility of implementation of net zero commitments because countries are lacking national governance infrastructure to back them up. And this is what we would like to talk about today, and specifically also the role of the rule of law and legal frameworks in creating that credible national governance infrastructure which would allow us to implement the Paris Agreement, and not only to achieve net zero targets, but actually to transition to climate resilience as well. And to do so, we need three things. First, we need clear goals. Clear goals in terms of adaptation, but also clear goals in terms of mitigation. Secondly, we need political buy-in into implementation, and we need support from the citizens and populations that would enable that transition. And finally, we need accountability. We need to ensure that actually governments would keep to the targets that they're putting forward. We need to make sure that companies will keep to the promises that they're putting forward. And that's where legal framework plays a critical role. Research and practical experience shows that when climate goals are introduced into climate legislation, it becomes more difficult to renegade them, to change them, because when you have elections or you have a new president coming in, because changes have to go through parliament. Secondly, before climate law gets implemented in democratic countries, there is a wide public debate. And that creates that buy-in from the general public, from different stakeholders into the objectives that we're putting forward. And finally, climate law allows us to ensure accountability. Governments and companies can be brought to court, and that's witnessed by the rise in climate litigation and in strategic cases where governments are sued for not being ambitious enough or for not meeting their climate targets. At the Grantham Research Institute for the past decade, we've been tracking climate laws and policies around the world, and we host a database which covers global all of the world. And we have seen tremendous growth in the legislative activity and policy-making activity on climate change. This map shows you the outlook in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted. And at that point in time, globally, we counted about 70 climate laws and policies related to climate change. If we go to today, that's how the world looks. There is virtually no country in the world which doesn't have some form of legislation or climate policy. And today our database contains 2,900 such laws and policies. And by the way, the database is open access. Anyone can search it. You can, if you haven't seen it, you can look at different sectors, different geographies. And in a few minutes, I'll share with you some very exciting development of a partnership and new capability which we launched during the scope. What is interesting is that the rise in the activities to address climate change is not only focused on executive policies, but we're actually seeing more and more countries adopting climate laws. But not all climate laws are created equal. And today, I think in our conversation, we are particularly focusing on the concept of framework climate law. It's the law which sets up strategic direction for the country, puts general objectives for climate policy, and also embeds the key governance features into the legal framework, which Anirudh will talk about in a minute. Oftentimes, when we talk about climate legislation, a question comes, well, surely it's mostly relevant for European countries, developed countries, and that is actually not true. This graphic here shows you that over the past years, a lot of legislation on climate change and policy making on climate change was actually happening in developing countries. And today we have panelists here to share with us really cutting-edge experiences from South Africa, from Peru, from Zimbabwe on how countries in the global south are legislating on climate change and what they have learned out of this process. But sometimes also legislating on climate change is difficult for the political reasons, and that's where the case from the United States comes in, which we're also going to hear more about. And you have to be creative to legislate on climate without actually legislating on climate directly. So we will hear how you deal with that political context later today. But I think what is our key starting point for our discussion today is that all countries around the world have different political contexts, have different, of course, socioeconomic context. And what we would like to talk about is how can we adapt climate laws to the different needs and circumstances arising in such countries. Some countries are highly vulnerable, and for them adaptation is a key priority. Some are have already put in place key institutions, but they lack emission reduction targets, so they might focus laws in different ways. And so we would like to start by presenting a research piece on which the three institutions co-organizing this event today have worked to really think through how can we help countries come up with identify the key features that climate legislation should address in their respective countries, thinking about what functions do we want law to play to enable country to actually address climate action. So Anirudh, over to you. Please.
Thanks so much, Alina, and I'm really grateful for all of you to be spending your evenings this late with us, and I hope to make this at least slightly entertaining for all of you. So essentially, the story that the three organizations that Alina mentioned, the Center for Policy Research, the Grantham Institute, and Climate Legal, teamed up with to tell is a slightly more complex one than is allowed for by the rather elegant solution that the Paris Agreement presents, namely the sort of breaking up of the temperature into carbon budgets that can then be allocated in a fair and just way across the world, and then every country basically just has the job of sticking by its carbon budgets. So we wanted to present the story as being slightly more complicated, especially in the developing world. And the governance functions approach that you see on your screen was, we thought, a way in which we could sort of contend with the sort of rather gnarly complexities that get thrown up in sort of energy transitions in the developing world particularly, but also very much in the developed world. So this sort of one-size-fits-all climate law approach that has hitherto been sort of syndicated and well established around the world, we wanted to argue doesn't really answer to many of the sort of problems in the developing countries, and the way to go about trying to solve these problems is essentially to start thinking about what the native problems are, or rather the problems that are native to the context, and then try and sort of tailor the solutions, namely the climate laws or analogous instruments, to answer specifically to those problems, and those problems in the order in which it's required. So I'll probably just begin with maybe like a slightly concrete example. So in the Indian context, for instance, and this applies to most of the developing world, we sort of operate in a context where the emissions, by all accounts, will have to rise, and more importantly, the energy consumption will have to rise, because by all accounts, sort of GDP indexes, human development indexes, GDP, I mean, these things are positively correlated with energy consumption, but decarbonization will have to happen then in a context of energy consumption rise, which is a very complex sort of endeavor to sort of deal with. So in these contexts, we'll have to be very careful about how we set our targets and how we go about mobilizing them. So, for instance, in the Indian context, the energy consumption is growing by a rate of 5 to 6% a year as it is. Now, the more sectors we sort of electrify, as it were, I mean, the more sectors that go electric, that means that there's going to be more strain on already sort of dusty and overstretched electricity grid. And given the sort of capricious nature of renewable energies, we might be in a situation where there's a retrenchment to coal, if not well managed. So this, apart from all the great adaptation challenges and vulnerabilities that developing countries are a lot more close to at a human level, means that we have to have context-specific solutions. What this doesn't mean is that there can't be any dialogue between countries on solutions. So in order to have dialogue on solutions whilst being context-specific, to straddle these two opposing lines, we devised this sort of mnemonic of governance functions, basically 9 governance functions that any country it would behoove policymakers there to seriously consider before actually jumping into the design of any particular policies. So the first one would be something like the long-term vision, the narrative that you want to set on how the country will contend with its climate transformation. So just in the past 2 years, going back to the Indian context, there's been an NDC that India released, which by all accounts is rather ambitious. 50% cumulative electric power installed, capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030, and then a net zero target by 2070. But then just a week ago, there was an LTS that was released, which basically said that India had a right to more than the entire global share of the remaining carbon budget. The rest of the carbon budget for the globe was something like 400, and India had a right to up to 471. So these contrasting sort of narratives come about, in our view, because if there isn't really one sort of overarching instrument that represents what Alina said, represents sort of consensus wrought by debate in a parliament. Namely, there isn't a law that represents a clear agenda which people can rally around and work towards. Which would be the case if it was sort of enumerated in a law. Then there's the question, and this is a very important one, of knowledge. So in developing countries, knowledge is, and of course in developed countries, but especially in developing countries, knowledge is key, the function of knowledge. Meaning that before we sort of jump down any path of actual decarbonization, we need to have a full sort of assay and assessment of precisely what the low carbon development opportunities are, where the opportunities are opening, what are the possible ways in which different sectors can form synergies and develop positive feedback loops, and what are the dangers, both in terms of locking into high carbon pathways, which may be irreversible, and also dangers in terms of vulnerability, extreme weather events, slow onset events, and so forth. And then, keeping that in mind, keeping the sort of the procedures in mind, we don't have an infinite time to act. So time-bound strategies are very important. Strategies that align with the long-term goal and are informed by robust knowledge production bodies. And for both these functions, many climate laws have climate bodies that serve these functions, such as the paragon of this is usually the UK's climate change body, which is a robust knowledge production and strategy setting body, and Alina will talk more about that later. And there's also the point that that oftentimes countries begin their climate journey, as it were, by experimenting a lot with environmental laws, sectoral laws, and so forth, and then eventually come to a framework law. So oftentimes there's a problem of different laws and policies working against each other or across purposes. So integration is an important function in that basically you want your legal and statutory propositions and commandments to align and sort of facilitate each other rather than work against each other. And most framework laws have the provision wherein you basically say that this law either supersedes all previous climate related laws, or there will be a mechanism whereby this law will amend all the other existing climate related laws to basically form synergy with it. And then there's the function of mainstreaming, and this is rather important in traditionally non-environmental sectors, transportation, building, agriculture, aviation, railways, and so forth. Because climate change is such an all of government, all of society problem, it tends to sort of need buy-in from various different sectors, but those sectors aren't traditionally, and again, especially in the developing world, equipped really financially or in terms of manpower or knowledge or sort of procedurally equipped to deal with climate transformations. So there has to be a slow process whereby through reporting duties and tying budgetary mechanisms to climate reports and climate action, the ambition within sectors can slowly be ramped up so that sectors can sort of gain capacity to go green eventually. And then the all-important one probably is coordination. Again, to take the Indian example, in the scenario of a coal phase down, for instance, the Indian railway system, 45% of its revenue is accounted for by coal freight, transportation of coal. So in the event of a coal phase down, suddenly now the Indian railway system no longer has a majority of its revenue. And then for the low income bracket of society, which is a huge portion of society in India, their railway travel is subsidized through coal freight, through the revenue gathered from coal freight. So now sort of migrant laborers no longer have a viable option to go to their jobs, and then the sort of the butterfly effect goes across sectors, and then of course the government's main revenue comes from taxation on coal. So suddenly health services and other public services collapse, and then you have the banking sector, which is sort of invested a lot of money in coal, and then suddenly the financial system becomes destabilized. So it's very important that different sectors, when they plan for decarbonization, decarbonization work together in an integrated way, and that the law provides mechanisms for this specifically. And the stakeholder alignment is a similar one, and I think Alina covered some of it in her talk, which is basically, given that there are going to be winners and losers, despite our best efforts as just transition, there needs to be ways in which there's buy-in from different actors, and that there are open and honest systems and transparent systems whereby different actors can come together and align on the strategies that are set. And finally, well, not finally, there's the sort of almost obvious one of finance. The South Korean example is clear here. In South Korea, they made a decision that you need stable laws in order for private companies to invest in the green space. And with sort of constantly changing laws and policies and indications coming from everywhere, the investment in green technology and the environment in general is often compromised. And also you need, again, budgetary tie-ins to slowly ramp up finance to then, for sectors to then be able to go green. It's all a sort of implicated process, and finance in some ways cuts across all the other functions and is in turn affected by the other functions. And finally, we have oversight and accountability. So this is another important one, and I think it's particularly germane to this COP, because oftentimes there's just that phrase that you might hear that there is no rule of law and therefore we can't, implement anything. I think it's time that we recognize that that's not a good enough answer, and that there are many ways in which, through the creation of an enabling law, you can overcome the problem of the rule of law and find alternate ways of holding certain targets and ambitions to account, namely by just making an energy transition more attractive through sort of capacity building and enabling pathways. But of course also laws also help with litigation. Some of you may have been in the previous session, and that point was also made. So on the whole, I think we can see that transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy in the developing world is going to be a very tricky process, and these governance functions really allow us to sort of think through this problem in each individual context, but also allow for conversation in between actors. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Anirudh. And so if anything, the message, I think, which we would like you to take away from this is that just taking a template law from somewhere else where it might have worked well is not really going to make it. And we actually do have examples where some consultants actually try to do that, change the name of the country and then just bring it over. But actually, applying this framework and thinking through what functions do we need to strengthen in our country in order to be effective in addressing climate change. And we hope that this framework sets a good point for discussion. And I wanted to share with you an enhancement of our tool which might actually help in application of this framework. So this is a snapshot of our existing database on your left, those of you who know it. And we're very happy to announce that in partnership with the Sabin Center for Environmental Law at Columbia University and with Climate Radar, which works in artificial intelligence, we are now going to have new capability in our database where you can actually use keyword search and search inside the texts of the laws. This is still at the moment in the trial phase, in the preview phase, but I'm just going to show you how that works. This is a snapshot. We took one function of what Anirudh presented, mainstreaming. We inputted some of the keywords that would link to the concept of mainstreaming. And one of the hits that you get is Kenya's Climate Change Act and the relevant paragraph out of it, which actually mandates that each state department and national government public entity shall have the following duties, which include integrating climate change action plan into sectoral strategies and so on. You can read in detail. Well, what we are hoping this will help to do is to make it easier for you to generate examples of relevant laws which have addressed similar functions that you might be looking to address in your own country. So with this, I don't want to take any more time. I'm really keen to hear from our amazing panel today on their own experiences on thinking about climate laws, applying them and implementing them. And so first I'm going to go to Andrew. Andrew Gilder is the Director of Climate Legal, and Andrew and his colleagues have been intimately involved in the drafting of South Africa's climate change law, but also advised many other countries in Africa in particular on climate change legislation. So Andrew, my question to you is, this approach, let me put the functions back on the screen. When you were designing South Africa's climate law, did you think about, the key governance functions? And if not, if you had this framework, do you think that would be helpful? And perhaps a follow-up, if you think about what you actually have drafted and what has got passed, do you see any gaps in terms of applying this? Thanks.
So thanks, Adil. Let's start there. It's fascinating seeing this list put up in front of you like this, because I might say to myself, so the climate change bill in South Africa, could I tick all of those boxes as I'm sitting and looking at this list now? And the answer is, on the face of it, probably not, if you were just barely reading the act itself. But if you have an understanding of how it fits in to the broad sweep of environmental law in the country, then you might become a little bit more comfortable that it is in fact going to touch all of those elements. That's the answer to your last question. The first question was, would it have helped when we were commencing the process of working on the South African bill to have had a paper like this to guide us? I'm going to come back to that at the end. If I could give a flavor of the process that we went through. So when I say we, I mean my business partner and I, Olivia Rumble, is watching us from back home at the moment. We're a two-person specialist climate change and carbon markets legal consultancy, and we did the work to advise the Department of Environment in South Africa to draft the climate change bill, which is currently before Parliament. So we did that work between 2016 and 2018. It was a 2-year process, which culminated in a published and gazetted bill in July 2018, and we still don't have an act. So it's a little bit depressing to have spent all of that time and energy and to now be sitting 4 years later still without having the legislation that we need. There are reasons for that. There are dynamics involved. One of those dynamics is that once the bill had been gazetted, it then went through another 4 years of negotiation between government, labor, and private sector to get to the document that we have now. I'm quite pleased to say that the document we have now, which is formally called Bill 9 of 2022, is substantially the legislation or the draft legislation that we finalized in 2018 with a couple of tweaks. One of the most prominent tweaks is that some of the teeth in the compliance mechanism have been removed, which I suspect was a compromise between government and the private sector. Is that necessarily a problem within the context of how South African environmental law is intended to work? Not necessarily. The idea of the draft bill that we have is that in the parlance of our environmental legal regime, It's a specific Environmental Management Act, so it's a thing called a SEMA. It is intended to be a framework act. It's an umbrella overarching act, and it is anticipated that under that act, a range of other legal and policy instruments will be evolved, including regulations, for example, around carbon budgets. That is not very helpful if you want to tick all of these boxes and go, does the South African climate change legal regime in evolution anticipate all of these governance functions? I think the answer is yes, it does. It will take time for us to get to the point that we have a very clear vision of how each one of these governance functions is realized using that act as the foundation. But now let me go back to what Anirudh has said. We don't really have that much time to dawdle along the road of litigation, of legislating for climate change. We've already been dawdling for some time. The point at which we started was, from a policy perspective, was something called the 2001 Climate Change Response Policy Paper, which is a white paper gazetted by government in 2011, which itself was the outcome of nearly 20 years of policy development. The first document in South Africa to call itself formally a climate change strategy is dated September 2004. I know, I still have the hard copy with my notes in the margin from when it was launched. Well thumbed now. So now in the South African context, we sit nearly 20 years later, 20 years of development of climate change policy, and we are yet to have a piece of legislation. I am very pleased to say, though, that the years of the evolution of that policy has given rise to regulatory development. So, for example, we have, we have, for example, greenhouse gas reporting regulations which were promulgated in terms of the Air Quality Act. Those regulations don't sit constitutionally very comfortably within the Air Quality Act, because air quality from a constitutional perspective in South Africa is a local government competence, but you can argue at least that climate change and mitigation from a constitutional perspective is a national government competence. These are some of the interesting issues that we had to grapple with in the process of working for a client that was effectively a committee of government officials, some of whom had objectives that were contrary to the objectives of some of their colleagues. So the exercise was an interesting one, because instead of it only being an exercise in crafting perhaps the best piece of draft legislation that we could prepare, it also was an exercise in managing political expectations and also expectations of turf and responsibility going forward. This made it a very interesting exercise. If you subscribe to the School of American Realism, one of the theories around how judges come to their decisions is that they make a decision almost instinctively and then retrofit the law, or sometimes in a haphazard basis, to justify the decision that we'd made. That's a little bit what it felt like drafting the South African Climate Change Act. I think it's a good piece of draft legislation. I'm really hoping that it will see the light of day as an act within the next 6 months or so. Now let's come back to the original question. Would it have helped to have had this paper when we were commencing drafting the act? The bill. Yes, it would have. I think it would have allowed us to arrange our thinking against this rubric that you see in front of you. We would effectively have been able to say, are there aspects of the existing and well-evolved policy landscape that we can perhaps package into these 9 governance functions so that we can, in a sense, be sure that we've covered all of the essential bases. So these 9 governance functions, in a sense, become an essential checklist for drafters of legislation to understand, do I have the foundations in place that will allow me to erect on those foundations the building of an appropriate climate law? I think leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I think quite a few people I saw nodding can relate to the frustration of how much effort and time drafting and passing climate legislation takes. But I think the points you've raised about this process being worthwhile because you actually align political expectations and also negotiate and form an understanding of future responsibilities. I think that's a very important point, and I think that goes back to what I said at the beginning, is that we can't manage this transition unless we get political buy-in from the key actors, both political actors but also the whole society. And I think what you've described actually goes to demonstrate this point. So let us change the continents. So I'm going to go to our next speaker, Rocío, who has been working for quite a long time on decarbonization and climate policy frameworks in Latin America, and in particular in Peru, and also focusing on carbon markets and Article 6. So Rocío, my first question is, in the Peruvian context, what was your experience with climate change law, but also some of the regulations that Peru is currently working on in relation to Article 6? And do you see the governance functions approach useful in this context?
Thank you, Alina. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me here and for you staying this late. I'm sure we all want to leave soon. So thank you for being here. So Peru, I don't know if you know, it has a framework law on climate change. It was approved in 2018. And as Alina was saying, there is no one-size-fits-all, of course. But in having this in mind, I would say that these 9 principles doesn't fit all either. Right? So I can relate very, very closely with some of them, but I would also identify stuff that was really important for Peru and that has not been necessarily highlighted here. I'm sure that, but the point here, not an idea of criticizing, but the point here is that when this is very useful for start the discussion or to trigger the discussion on what a framework law should include and what not. So I can put a bit of an example of what was really important for Peru, and I don't see here reflectly strongly. So I would say that it fits somehow in number 6, but it is not clearly stated. And it is the fact that we really needed, when I say we, I refer Peru, we really needed a clear definition on the roles. And with this, I mean that the Ministry of Environment in Peru, I'm afraid, and I am sad for thinking this, but I think it is the reality in many countries. The Ministry of Environment are not very powerful. And when we're talking about making something transversal, they need to have a clear role in mandating other ministries, including the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Economy or the Ministry of Planning, that are usually the most powerful, to be able to tell them what to do. And this is not necessarily the case. And at least in the Peruvian case, if there wasn't such a strong command and such a clear description of the role, there was many cases in which the Ministry of Environment was not being heard. So the framework law helped us for MINAM to have a clear role in how to transversalize environment in the other ministries, and it had a real role for the other ministries to implement. In the 90s, the Peruvian government started a decentralization process. So I don't know if you know a bit of our structure, but Peru has 30 million people, 10 million of them living in the capital city, in Lima. So of course, there is a huge concentration of power and capacities. And what this happened is that we try to decentralize the country for people staying in their own regions and working there and developing the capacities there. But this didn't happen. So the process is still in the process for many reasons. Probably the first one is because the central government doesn't want it to happen and will always use the argument, which is also real, that their capacities are not there. But the only reason I'm explaining this decentralization process is because many of the other ministries, say, meaning agriculture, housing, water, they do have representation at the subnational level because they are implementing authorities. MINAM, the Ministry of Environment, does not have that. So they do not implement, they only regulate, right? So in this regard, the climate change framework law in Peru was key in giving the authority to the Ministry of Environment to tell other authorities in the country what to do. And this was key for our country. Another aspect that I would like to highlight that I could also see embedded in some of these 9 numbers is another point that was key, which is to include a set of clear definitions of concepts in the law. So what is climate change? What is adaptation? What is mitigation? What is MRB, right? I mean, all of these reporting, monitoring, climate finance, these are everywhere in the Peruvian nightmare of legislation, but there is no clear understanding. So now we talk everywhere about the taxonomy. This was a first attempt to have a common understanding of what these concepts, basic concepts that we are all discussing about, are for the Peruvian government. So based on that, then you can create and articulate other legislation or strategies. And sorry, am I too long already? So that my last point, sorry I didn't talk about Article 6 at all, but my third point, which was very important and I forgot it now, so I can switch to, my third point was, sorry, I completely forgot my third point. So I can switch a little bit on the Article 6 point. This was also important and a huge win for the Ministry of Environment. Sorry, I remember. I remember, I just read it. In the Peruvian discussion, it was also very important to go around this number 3, right? Which was to include short and long-term targets. I don't know if you know this, but we changed government very quickly. I mean, so more than the legislation mandates, meaning that we did not want to include, or the Peruvian government did not want to include long-term targets nor shorter ones. We have them now in a strategy that is to be published, but we did not want to include them because we know that this kind of legislation, and this was mentioned by Andrew and by Alina, is really difficult to change in time. So when you have them set there, the opposition will always, from wherever it comes from, it will always come and will try to relate to that target. So if we are talking about ambition, and we all want to be ambitious here, increasing the target, it is key for the government and to keep working towards that new targets based on ambition. So if we Peru, on Ministry of Environment, wanted to be able to put forward with that, go forward with that ambition, we decided that it was not the best for the country to have it fixed in a framework law.
Thank you, Rocío. It's a great example of actually how climate laws have to be adapted to the local context. So you've highlighted coordination and mainstreaming was the key challenge for you. I suppose the question is going forward to be able to actually implement the objectives and also the Peruvian NDC to the full extent. Would the law have to change in the future? But perhaps we can come to that when we go to the discussion while you're thinking of it. And we're going to switch again continents, and we're going to go to Rachel Cleetus, who is the Policy Director at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Rachel, you and your organization, of course, have been involved very deeply in the US climate policy and legislation. So would you share with us a little bit your perspective on the US Inflation Reduction Act? What was the strategic objective and how is it important to climate change?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alina. And looking at this set of principles here, I found myself wishing that this is how things worked in the U.S. But unfortunately, it's not so rational. We did this summer secure the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a very big bill that has many components to it, including some not related to climate and energy, on healthcare, et cetera. But on the climate pieces, it has some very important tax incentives for clean energy. It has incentives for electric vehicles, public transit, environmental justice priorities like cleaning up legacy pollution from fossil fuels. There was investments in climate resilient agriculture. And an earlier bill passed last year, a big infrastructure bill, included a lot of investments in infrastructure like grid, transmission grids, EV charging infrastructure, et cetera. But how did we get here? I would say the most important part is number 7 in the US, which is stakeholder engagement and alignment. The United States is almost unique in countries across the world where there is still a high degree of climate skepticism and outright denial. We have an entire political party that has sat on the sidelines as this Inflation Reduction Act was passed, basically refusing to do anything about climate change. And it is to the point that the IPCC report that came out earlier this year actually called out this phenomenon in the United States on 2 fronts, saying that rhetoric and misinformation on climate change and the deliberate undermining of science have contributed to misperceptions of the scientific consensus, uncertainty, disregarding risk and urgency, and that has slowed down policy. And additionally, strong party affiliation and partisan opinion polarization has contributed to this delay. And they call out the United States in particular. This is in the North America chapter of the IPCC Working Group 2 report. And what that tells you is that we're operating in an environment where principle number 1 is completely absent half the time, a well-constructed narrative of climate change objectives, because there's a fundamental disagreement about the scientific facts. So how do you move forward policy in an environment like that? Well, in the US, it requires working on different levels. Yes, there's the federal government level, which is where we secured the Inflation Reduction Act. But there are a lot of states that have been moving, regardless of what's happening at the federal level. They have been moving policies on climate for years now. Clean energy policies, climate resilience policies, energy efficiency policies, et cetera. At the federal level, it has been years in the making to get this bill done. Most of us felt relief more than anything else. About 10 years ago, over 10 years ago, we had another run at this at the federal level through something called the Waxman-Markey bill, and that failed. It passed the House and then was never brought to a vote in the Senate because the votes weren't there. And this time around, there was an understanding from the administration and Congress that one entire party would be unlikely to come to the table. We had a divided Congress, evenly divided. And so a very particular strategy was used. In the US, to pass legislation, you usually need 60 votes in the Senate. But there is a special maneuver called a budget reconciliation approach. Things that have a budgetary impact can be passed in a bill where you just need 50 votes plus the vote of the vice president as a tiebreaker. And so in the United States, we had 50 votes from one party, the same party that the president is from. And essentially the path forward, that was the only path forward. And so the bill that's passed is an interesting one. It is not a legislation in the sense of literally creating new programs so much as budget items. So things that you can, more carrots, let's say, than sticks. So investments in clean energy, investments in infrastructure, investments in cleanup, a lot of money going to different federal agencies to implement these laws. And then when the law was passed, there were other things mushed into it, including, as I said, healthcare and other things like that. And even so, it hung in the balance for months. We had a couple of senators and one particular senator who was really holding back. And because the vote was so close, it could not pass. So it was months and months of waiting, and then finally a breakthrough. And this now we're in the fight to implement it in the most robust way possible at the state level, at the local level. And this is where it really requires bringing together stakeholders from all across the nation, because the bill for some people is not so much a climate bill as a jobs bill or a clean up pollution bill or an infrastructure bill. So not everybody is looking at it through the lens of climate change, and that's really critical. I actually don't think that's unique to the United States. Climate change is connected to almost every aspect of our lives now, and people come in through different doors. They're thinking about healthcare, they're thinking about disasters and how to respond to disasters that are precipitated by climate change, and finding a way to bring people together regardless of which door they're walking through, so that you can actually meet the needs that are coming at us, not just to cut emissions, but also build climate resilience. And that's one piece I just want to say out loud. The US law that passed does not have very much for climate resilience. There's a little bit for wildfires and tribal grants for resilience, but there's very little, so that's still a big outstanding piece on that. And the other piece it doesn't tackle is, given that we're at COP27, important to point out, there is nothing for the international space, not much in this bill. The United States has a huge responsibility on climate finance, of course, because it is a rich country. It is the largest historical emitter of greenhouse gases. But there is no inclusion of climate finance or anything for loss and damage, for example, in this bill. And that's also a big fight in the United States, because Congress holds the power of the purse. So President Biden can make a commitment, as he did last year, that the U.S. will provide $11.4 billion in international climate finance by 2024. But if Congress doesn't appropriate the funding, then that promise will go unfilled. And so that's why we have to fight on all fronts in the U.S. to make sure that we live up not just domestically, but internationally to our responsibilities.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I think that's a really interesting example, and important also point that you raised, that it's important to choose the door you walk through. Sometimes it's not the climate door, not always. So I think that's a really important learning and takeaway. So with this, let's switch back to Africa, and our next speaker is Lloyd Mazivarimwe. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name, I know, apologize. Lloyd is an environmental lawyer who has worked on water, climate change and environmental issues for the government of Zimbabwe for 10 years now. Lloyd, you have been very intimately involved in the design of the Zimbabwean climate law, which is currently in draft. We're very curious to learn what is the objective of the law, what problems is it trying to solve, and what are its key components.
Thank you so very much, Alina. And also, many thanks to the speakers from South Africa, from India, Peru, and the US. So in terms of the purpose why Zimbabwe is in the process.
I think yours is not working properly.
I don't know if I'm now audible. No, all right. So thank you so very much, Alina, for the introduction, and many thanks to India, South Africa, Peru, and the US for sharing their experiences. For Zimbabwe, the reason why we are in the process of coming up with climate change laws. So Zimbabwe ranks 10th in terms of the Global Climate Change Vulnerability Index. And this is an index which has over 200 countries, and Zimbabwe ranks 10th. Further to that, we are in agri-economy, and in terms of our economy, 80% of our farmers, they rely on rainwater. So there's always been a correlation between availability of water and how we do as a country in terms of our economy. So with climate change, with the frequencies which we've been experiencing in terms of droughts, in terms of floods, we've been suffering. We've been suffering so much that in terms of in the I think it's 2019 cyclone Idai, Zimbabwe suffered economic losses of about $279 million. $279 million. And our neighbor, Mozambique, it is estimated that they suffered more than $3 billion in terms of their economic losses. We can debate about the figures, but it is indisputable that we are suffering losses as a region, because as a region we are semi-arid, we are arid. So the reason why we are coming up with specific climate change law is specifically to have something that effectively speaks to a climate change response. And then in this space, we'll be talking about adaptation. We'll also be talking about having to build a climate resilience. Also, just a transition. It's one of the key priorities for Africa. And so in a nutshell, this is why we, as Zimbabwe, as a Southern African nation, we are coming up with specific climate change laws. Of course, there are other sectorial laws, but however, we feel like if we are to be having an effective climate change law, we need to be having a framework law that speaks to some of the functions there. And speaking of the functions which have been presented by Dr. Alina, I think in many respects, Zimbabwe, even though we are at a commencement stage where we do not have a climate change bill as of yet, we do have a climate change principles which have been submitted to our government, the Cabinet of Ministers, for their consideration. And in terms of that, they in many respects speak to some of the nine governance functions which were presented earlier. So if I'm to be picky, perhaps the coordination between sectors. Maybe there is a need for a little bit more articulation in terms of what we are proposing that Zimbabwe adopts. Also, there could be something to do with the participatory rights stakeholder engagement. But in the main, Zimbabwe is commenced efforts, and as a country that ranks 10th, we are taking this serious, and we are hoping that from COP27 we'll be able to come up with something that's going to be positive not only for Zimbabwe, Africa, but the rest of the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. I think we reached a point where we would like for you to ask the panel what you're interested in. Are there any questions from the audience? Please, where is the mic? If you could kindly introduce yourself, your name and where you come from, that would be great. Thank you.
Just for clarification, can we make comments also?
Please, short comments as well, and please introduce yourself.
My name is Benson Ochieng. I'm from Kenya. I work for the Institute for Law and Environmental Governance. I practice environmental law, and I teach law at the University of Nairobi Center for Advanced Studies in Environmental Law and Policy. I was one of the key draftsmen of Kenya's Climate Change Act 2016 and was involved in a number of processes, including the strategy in 2010, climate finance policy in 2017, and the Climate Change Act policy 2017. Looking at that as my yardstick, just to make some quick comments about the law. Agenda setting, let me call number one agenda setting, essentially setting out the objectives for the law. In our case, and from what I'm seeing across the continent, is that much of it is ad hoc. My friend from Zimbabwe, of course, has talked about the vulnerability of the country, but much of the legislation coming out on climate change in Africa is not aligned to the overall objectives that are aligned with government ambition and agenda for climate change. And in the case of Kenya, nothing attests to this more than the fact that it was actually a civil society initiative as opposed to government initiative. Much later in the process is when government felt embarrassed that this was being introduced in the assembly as a private member's bill and took it over. The second, I wanted to talk to another number there. Let me just pick it.
It's okay, just name the function, doesn't matter
yes,
the number.
Let me just name the function. So actually, let me just conclude that. So there is a disconnect between what the general policies say or actual policies on climate change say and what sometimes the Act seeks to regulate, because in the ideal case, legislation ought to follow the law as the implementing instruments for the law. And many times they are not speaking together. So let me pick on the fourth issue. That brings me to the issue of setting objectives for the legislation. And if there is a disconnect, what happens is that what the first speaker talked about, aligning the different sectoral legislation objectives with the framework legislation objective, it doesn't fit well. Creates a big problem in Anglo-Saxon legal tradition of interpretation, because you find the idea of framework law is not embedded in the legal interpretation for legislation in the Commonwealth generally or Anglo-Saxon tradition. A law that comes later supersedes the previous law. And where there is a specific and a general law, the specific law supersedes. So it doesn't matter whether you name it framework law. The interpretation from the Attorney Generals, and we've had this in Kenya, we'll always tell you no, the specific law supersedes regardless of whether climate change is cross-cutting and regardless of what the first speaker says, regardless of whether you indicated that it should supersede all the other laws. And lastly, oversight becomes a problem. because a lot of these legislation are framework laws. Where it is framework, it basically sets the general outline of what the ambitions that you need, meaning you don't have the implementing arms in terms of regulations that can be interpreted by courts and by authorities. In fact, in many cases, the authorities that are sought to be created by legislation have not been created. In Kenya's case, Climate Change Council, which was supposed to be the overarching oversight body, has never sat for various reasons, but principally because the basic understanding of how the regulation was supposed to operate was not done. So just before I came here, I was working on a draft amendment bill, basically to relocate the Climate Change Directorate from the Ministry of Environment to the Office of the President so that it can have a convening power. Otherwise, all these ministries act at same level, and it's very difficult when you say that one is going to convene the others. Thank you. Sorry for taking time, but I thought I wanted to mention that.
Thank you so much. I think that's a fascinating comment. I already see several panel members wanting to jump on it. Let's do briefly.
So, Benson, thanks very much. Actually, I had a lot to say, and then you made this last point, which frankly, for me, is the most important one, is the convening power, moving this function into the presidency. I think that's a really, really interesting idea. The point I'd like to reflect upon, actually, there are two, very, very briefly. Rocío's comments and Benson's comments and the comments from our other panelists in reaction to this really just proves the point that it's about the context. It's about the local context. So a map or a plan like this is a catalyst for thought in many instances, and that can be one of its greatest values. Here's my last thought. All of these processes are messy. It doesn't matter how carefully you think you've planned for something or how well you understand it, it's going to be messy. And I'd like to just illustrate that by making a point about another piece of work that we're doing. So we've been doing some work with an economist, very well-respected, internationally renowned economist. He was trying to understand just why South Africa's carbon tax was so complicated. Because from an economics perspective, it's easy to do a carbon tax. You just say, that over there, tax it, use the existing system. Yes, but you've got to do it in the messy and difficult world of reality, of politics and people and society. And it's effectively the same idea. It's a rubric for thinking that should drive the process forward. Thank you.
Lloyd, very quickly.
Thank you so very much to the colleague from Kenya. I just wanted to say that in Zimbabwe, in our thinking, the setting is always at the office of the president in cabinet in terms of climate change. But however, just also to support what Andrew here is saying, it's not necessarily where it is being set. I actually think that it's a mindset, and as the various players in government, in academia, in civil society, as private players, I think we do have a very significant role to play. Just to give an example, we in Zimbabwe, in terms of our Environmental Management Act, which is an act of 2002, there is something which is referred to as the National Environmental Council, established in 2002, but it has never set. It has never been operationalized, even though and also there is a fear. There is a fear that even though that we are escalating, for lack of a better term, even if we're escalating to a cabinet committee or a whatnot, I think I just think that is the attitude of the peoples that we carry the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. So there is another question in front.
Thank you very much. My name is Lara Lázaro. I'm a senior analyst at Elcano Royal Institute, a think tank in Spain, and a lecturer in economic theory at a university in Spain affiliated to the Complutense University. One clarification question, if I may, about the numbers, and a question perhaps to all the panel regarding the role of science in driving and assessing climate policy. So my clarification question is on numbers 4 and 5, and I'm wondering whether number 5 refers to perhaps things like green budgeting or something else. Sorry, I haven't read the paper. And I was wondering whether you could comment on scientific advisory bodies and the role they play or they could play in order to have teeth in your climate laws. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in. So I belong to the Union of Concerned Scientists, so we obviously believe very strongly that a good policy should be centered in good science. The reality is that the facts, unfortunately, are increasingly contested in the United States. And but the thing about climate change is it doesn't care whether you believe in it or not. And it's not a belief system. And it's affecting everybody in the country, everywhere, in the US and around the world. And I think one thing that has shifted the politics a little bit, at least, is the lived experiences of people now of these extreme disasters and also slow onset disasters like sea level rise. The United States right now is seeing these record heat waves and wildfires and droughts. The mighty Mississippi River is running so low right now. Barges are having trouble carrying cargo down it. And these start to have very real, people, wherever they live, they're seeing it in their backyard. And so the thing about science is it's not just about facts and research papers and journals, it's also about people's lived experiences. And many, many people are seeing a world that looks very different from the one in which they grew up in, or even the one that they remember from 10 years ago. And it's starting to affect the underlying politics, I think. The reality, though, is that we are in a moment now where dealing with climate change, because we've delayed so long, requires transformational change. It's not just incremental stuff on the edges. You really have to get to the root causes, to fossil fuels. And here we have a very powerful fossil fuel lobby in the United States. It's not by accident that we have not had policy all this time. They have been spreading lies and deception about the science for decades, and they continue to do so. And they're very cynically using this war in Ukraine, this unjust war, to perpetuate even more fossil fuel infrastructure in the United States. So a root cause analysis is really, really important. You can't just fritter away on the edges. You really have to get to the heart of how is the power being built and maintained in the system, and how can you dismantle it? And that's why using every tool, legislation, regulation, and yes, indeed, litigation, to break that power is going to be important to shift us out of this fossil fuel-based system that is not just causing climate change, but incredible environmental injustices all around the world, to a system that's fairer, more just, powered by clean energy. And our work in the United States, I think the transformational work that made the Inflation Reduction Act possible was for climate activists to understand with a little humility that it isn't just about climate. Climate is colliding with COVID, with the energy crisis, with the economic crisis, with very long-standing systems of racial oppression. And if we don't have solutions that act in a multifaceted way, we're not going to actually get to the core of the problem. So environmental justice has become a very central tenet alongside science in how we do good policy making. And I think it's a lesson that climate advocates really need to hold in very front and center, that you're not going to solve climate in a corner somewhere by doing some magic thing, whether it's a carbon tax or whatever. you have to connect it to people's daily life concerns and their experiences.
To answer your question on the difference between mainstreaming and integration, that's something actually we had sort of robust debate about amongst the co-authors, whether they should be separate or whether they should be bundled up into one. And I think eventually we decided to have it separated out for the sort of astute reason that you pointed out, that mainstreaming manifests itself in climate laws through different features, such as budgeting. Whereas if we go back to what the professor from Kenya mentioned about how the laws sometimes struggle with the legacies of previous laws that sometimes work across purposes, then the integration role is circumscribed to some extent to basically making sure that existing laws and policies have the same sort of goal or agenda, or rather that they're made consonant in some ways. Whereas you would think of mainstreaming as sort of capacity building through procedural duties that slowly ramp up ambitions within individual sectors. I also wanted to ask a question to Alina specifically about climate bodies. So climate bodies and institutions are such important parts of most climate laws, and I wanted her to maybe dwell on the UK's climate body and maybe in the context of the governance function say what its role is and whether you think, Alina, that climate bodies are essential parts of climate laws in general.
Thanks, Anirudh. I'll comment on that in a minute. I think I'll go to Rocío first to comment on mainstreaming versus integration first, and then we'll go to the audience questions straight away.
Thank you. I will be quick. I am just rethinking the question, because I want to answer you with a question, and I don't want to regret my answer. But I in my heart, what I want to assume is that the fact that we are creating this law respond to the fact that we believe in science. Otherwise, you would not regulate it and try to do something. I want to believe this. I can imagine some political scenarios when you do it because other shady reasons. But when I was hearing Rachel, what she was saying precisely, we cannot pass a law of such a magnitude is because there are some disbelievers. The fact that you have this law should reflect that the majority is believing, so you have the strength to pass such a law. This is what I would say. So you don't need the science reflected in the text necessarily. I think that the text is already, this is why I'm saying that I might regret it, but the fact that there is already a law, there is a recognition of the country, well, precisely because of that, I said I might regret it, because I can imagine some situations, but I think this is what I want to believe in my heart.
So, and that's a point that we can debate. We have a few questions, but maybe just I come very quickly because that directly relates to the discussion that we've opened. The role of independent expert advisory bodies is precisely in that many countries building upon UK's model, but we now have them also in many European countries, but also in Latin America, in Philippines, in Costa Rica. Independent expert advisory body is created precisely to provide an independent, non-political assessment of climate policy goals and in many countries also of the progress with implementation of climate law and climate policy more broadly. And what it creates, it depoliticizes knowledge and science and depoliticizes as well the assessment of how well the country is doing. And we at the Grantham Research Institute have done research looking specifically at the UK's Climate Change Committee. And what we found is that over 10 years of operation, they have played an essential role in policy integration. Their analysis has been cited by parliamentarians not only when discussing climate change related matters, but actually energy bill, water bill, adaptation related policies, even Brexit. Secondly, they've been able to become a trusted source of information across the political spectrum. So parliamentarians from both Conservative, Labour, Green Party, across the spectrum, also private sector NGOs, they go to the assessments by UK Climate Change Committee. So that actually takes, creates a baseline, non-debatable baseline for A, where we are, and B, where we need to get. And the debate is then about how do we get there. That's where the skepticism or progressive kind of ambition pushers crash. But let me stay there, and please, we have two questions, so we'll take both of them and we go to the panel.
Thank you so much. So my name is Joyce Kimtai, and I come from Ministry of Environment in Kenya. I'm a climate scientist, and I particularly research on attribution science, which looks at the role of climate change in extreme events. And this area of research fits very well on the topic of loss and damage, where we try to say, okay, these events can be attributed to climate change. Then there is the question of liability and compensation for those who are affected by these impacts. So my question is really on accountability, and I'm talking about especially on climate policy goals. So we have this policy within our countries where we have these particular goals. We either have a national policy or sectoral policies, and we have certain goals towards achieving this. But then we see that with changes in governments, these laws keep changing. And, for us even to achieve the Paris goal, we it's more of a concerted effort with with all countries. But then if we have these laws, these governments changing within our countries, and we also know that even the agreements that we have within ourselves as countries are not actually binding in any way. It's not like it's a law that you're accountable for. Then I just wanted to get your opinion on from any of you speakers on what do you think we should be doing actually to move from get more of a global law. I don't know if that is possible, and I know that might not be possible, where can hold us accountable to all their actions, to our commitments, to our agreements, and can make us get somewhere. Because to me, it looks like we can agree on something, then tomorrow a party can decide to pull from it, and then we are back to square one, then we come again for COP, and then we make this. So I'm just thinking that really, what do we think about what is the way forward? What's the best approach to holding ourselves accountable to achieving our policy goals? Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's a very challenging question, which I'm sure a few people will have a view. I think there was another hand at the back, so let's take both questions and try to squeeze answer in the remaining 5 minutes.
Good evening. I'm Leah Kaye. I'm from Lebanon, from the Ministry of Environment. I was actually wondering on the role of parliamentarian in this across these 9 functions, because traditionally we think that parliamentarians come at the level 9, so they just have an oversight role and for accountability. But I mean, through the last years, we have seen how, you just said it perfectly, how the Ministry of Environment usually has less capacity, less implementation. It's a weak ministry, usually within governments. So we're stuck with the ministries that does not really have leverage to develop a climate policy. And sometimes we don't have the capacity or the energy from the local communities and NGOs to come up with climate policies. So how can we leverage on the role of parliamentarians? How can we include them more? And I was disappointed not to see someone from the IPU within the panel, because I really think that we might be missing on a very important group of actors that can make a change where until today, most of the countries are stuck in their climate policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question, an excellent one. Just on your comment regarding IPU, they're watching us remotely. They unfortunately couldn't stay through the end of the COP, and our event is scheduled at the end. But there was a parliamentary summit over the weekend, but also before the COP. There have been quite a lot of activities, and parliamentarians have an essential role to play in this, not just on accountability, but also obviously on objective setting through the debate and actually defining what the law and the country strategy would entail, all the way through mainstreaming and policy integration. Again, the UK's example, Parliament then legislates on sectoral legislations, right, on energy, on water, on infrastructure. So they do have an essential role then in integrating and mainstreaming climate throughout. But there are more examples, but I'll let the panel members also comment on that. And then who wants to also tackle the first question on accountability?
Very slightly.
Yeah?
So that first question, sorry, where's the first question from? So it's a really, really difficult question, and it's huge. So I'll do the best I can from my perspective. The value of national laws is that they, to some extent, impose obligations that will persist for an extended period of time. The difficulty that we have with the system that you described at the international level is that, and it plays out in the negotiations. Doesn't matter what happens really at the end of a COP and the applause and the weeping and hugs that we see in Paris. The countries are negotiating from their national interest. So the idea of an international law that imposes obligations on countries and peoples and somehow sanctions them for contravening that law, that's not how we govern ourselves as humans. What we do though is we have those kind of ideas at the domestic level, and if we reach consistency across the domestic levels, then we go some of the way to resolving the question. Does that
Just a small follow-up on what Andrew said in answer to Joyce's question. I think that's the central dichotomy I was trying to present with the governance functions, is basically that there are regulatory approaches that sometimes, with the sort of shifting fortunes of, political, warfare, come to be vilified and then abandoned. But there's also the enabling capacity building approach that laws can take, the purpose of which would then be to make it in the interest of the actors on the ground to continue with the larger goals at hand. So essentially the things like the mainstream function and the finance function, what they do is they basically shift the ground upon which actors are, acting, and then make it in their interest, essentially, to continue with the strategy that's been laid out. So that's the dichotomy, I think, that we have to think about and start moving away from a one-size-fits-all legal approach to more enabling approaches in places where it's required.
Thank you, Anirudh. And actually, it's a perfect timing that links very well to the question about the role of parliamentarians. So Amira just got here just in time. So Amira Saber is a member of Parliament of Egypt in the House of Representatives. She's been tied up, but Amira wanted to share exciting news with us.
Thank you for having me, and I totally align with what is said on the slide here. I'm a parliamentarian from Egypt, and actually last year I introduced a bill towards combating food waste. And as you know, food waste has a lot to do both on climate change and also with the food security issues which you're having right now. And it was astonishing that in a country that has 32% of its population under the poverty line, we are wasting tons of food. The FAO estimated the amount of food wasted per person in Egypt is 50 kilograms per year. And we are 110 million plus human beings in Egypt. So I felt like France has a legislation. I did the comparative analysis. Italy has one, China has one. While the countries which are in most need to manage the food waste scene, they don't have a similar legislation. If it's out, it would be like the first and main region, and definitely the first in Egypt, because we didn't have in the legislative framework anything to combating food waste. The beautiful thing about it is that in human-centered issues, you don't have too many frictions with the opposition, with the right wing. It's something which mostly has a kind of consensus. So it brings everyone together on the table. I had run the discussion with the different stakeholders, and it had happened to be that the Ministry of Social Solidarity, along with the Food Safety Council, and also we have an Egyptian food bank, they all welcomed it a lot. So this is a role of parliamentarians to just jump in, align with the different stakeholders, see where is the gap, and propose the bill. It's referred now to the relevant committees in the parliament. It's being proceeded. And the other one I proposed just 2 days before coming to COP, and it's about climate change directly. Again, we didn't have in Egypt the word climate change in our legislative framework. We had laws to govern the environment, laws regarding investment, so it was like separate laws, but something to talk about and tackle decarbonization, a certain carbon limit by the force of law upon which we can increase the tax on the industrial entities. It wasn't there in the legislative framework before. Same goes for the rationalizing the usage of plastic in Egypt, because on the level of the awareness, if we go at a supermarket in Egypt, still the guy who is handling the stuff inside the bags, he's like giving you two bags, 3 bags as a kind of a compliment. So still on the level of the awareness, we need to mobilize a lot the momentum towards the usage of plastic, which again has a lot to do with climate change. This is with banning even the private jets to fly inside the country, or even if it happened, it would be with a very, very high level of tax, just to do the fair share of sharing it. I don't want to take more of the time, but thank you very much for giving me the floor and the chance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amira. That's a really exciting development. Well done for taking this leadership, and we wish you all the best as the bill progresses. With this, we're unfortunately out of time, but thank you so much for joining us today, for raising your questions and comments, and most of all, thank you to our panelists for excellent contribution.
Hello?